That circle wasn't made by coyotes. Sam's voice was low as he stared at the snow, hoof prints in perfect formation, wrapping his cabin like a noose. Then the girl stepped beside him, her eyes calm as the wind. "They've come for me. Welcome MS Incredible Stories. Let's uncover what really happened." Sam Ward stood at his window, rough palms resting on the weathered sill as dusk settled across the prairie. The sky faded to bruised purples and blues, a quiet reminder of another long day slipping away. 45 winters had passed through him, but this one felt heavier, laden with memories he could not shake. His beard, streaked with white at the chin, framed a face carved by loss. His shoulders carried grief like a physical weight, the kind that made each breath slower, each movement deliberate. 3 years ago, he had buried his wife beneath a lone cottonwood tree that bent toward the creek as if mourning with him. Since then, the cabin had become a shrine to absence. Her woven shawl still hung on the back of a chair he never sat in. The shelf of dried herbs she once tended gathered dust, untouched since her hands last arranged them. He still slept on one side of the bed, though the other had long been cold and empty. There had been a child once, too, a daughter who never took her first breath. After that, Sam stopped building cradles. Instead, he built fences, mended saddles, and kept to himself. The town whispered about the quiet man who rode in once a month, spoke only when coin changed hands. Some said grief had broken him. Others believed he'd always been that way. On this evening, the cold air seeped in under the door as Sam traced familiar patterns with his gaze. The wind whispered through the barren trees, carrying an emptiness that matched his own. No calls of birds, no rustle of small animals, just silence settling deep in the earth. He turned from the window and moved toward the fire, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the cabin walls. Sam sat in his worn chair, the creak of wood filling the quiet space. He did not reach for a shotgun tonight. There was no threat here, only the weight of memories that clung tighter with every passing night. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and still, as if holding its breath alongside the man who had lost so much yet remained standing. The wind howled across the snow-covered plains, slipping through cracks in the cabin walls like a restless spirit. Sam Ward moved slowly, methodical as always, tending the small fire that sputtered low in the hearth. Outside, the cold bit deep, sharp enough to sting exposed skin and freeze breath before it could fully form. The world beyond the cabin was muted, blanketed in thick white silence that swallowed sound and light alike. Sam wrapped his coat tighter around his shoulders, the worn fabric no match for the creeping chill. His fingers, rough and scarred, worked to stack more wood, the snap and crackle of dry logs the only reprieve from the endless winter night. He paused for a moment by the window, staring out at the dark horizon where the last hints of daylight had long since vanished. The stars were faint, hidden behind a thick curtain of clouds. The cabin felt smaller than usual tonight, the shadows gathering in corners like unwelcome visitors. Sam's breath fogged in the cold air as he exhaled, his mind drifting to the empty chair by the fire and the bed that only half held a presence. The silence pressed in, heavy and unyielding. Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying with it a sound, a faint, irregular noise that did not belong to the usual night. Sam's ears pricked, the muscles in his neck tensing as he strained to listen. It was a soft, halting sound like something or someone limping through the snow. His hand instinctively reached for the shotgun, resting by the door, not out of fear, but from years of habit. He stepped outside, boots crunching in the frost-hardened earth, eyes scanning the darkened landscape. The cold air bit at his face, but he held steady, his breath slow and controlled. There, beneath the cedar tree by the barn, lay a figure curled into itself against the biting wind. A young woman, barely more than a girl, her dress torn and bloodied, skin pale and bare against the snow. Sam's grip on the shotgun loosened as he took her in, the fragility, the exhaustion, the desperate silence. Without a word, he lowered the gun and moved toward her, careful not to startle. This cold winter night had brought more than just frost and shadow. It had brought a storm that would change everything. Sam knelt slowly beside the figure in the snow, his breath steady despite the cold biting at his lungs. The girl lay curled tightly beneath the cedar tree, her body folded as if trying to make herself smaller than the night's harshness. Her dress was torn along the sleeve, stained dark with dried blood that seeped into the snow beneath her. Barefoot, bruised, and pale, she looked more like a ghost than a living thing. For a long moment, Sam simply looked, the weight of what he saw pressed heavy in his chest. An unspoken story of pain and survival etched into every fragile line of her. She stirred slightly, lips cracked and dry, whispering words in a language he didn't understand. The soft murmur felt like wind threading through the branches. Comanche, perhaps. He hadn't seen any of their people near this land in years, not since soldiers had driven them away in the name of peace. Sam's hand hovered uncertainly, then moved with care, lifting her as gently as if she might shatter. She was lighter than sorrow itself, a fragile bundle carrying the scent of river water and smoke. He carried her across the frozen ground toward the cabin, each step deliberate, the snow crunching beneath his boots in rhythm with the slow beat of his heart. Inside, the cabin held its breath, the firelight flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Sam laid her near the hearth, wrapping her in a blanket free from the weight of memory. The girl's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing dark pools that held stories she could not yet tell. She flinched once as he stitched a deep but clean gash on her arm, the quiet skill of a man who had once tended wounds long ago before war and loss had taken hold. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, fragile but unbroken. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, but inside, the storm had passed for now. Sam stepped out to wash his hands, letting the cold air clear the heaviness from his chest. When he looked back, the girl was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, a small light flickering in the dark. The night pressed close, the cold wrapping itself around the cabin like a second skin. Sam stood near the window, watching the cedar tree where he had found her. The silhouette of the branches swayed faintly against the dark sky, shadows cast by the firelight flickering inside. The memory of the girl beneath those boughs clung to him, sharp and unsettling. He had never imagined a night like this, finding a young woman, injured and alone, in the unforgiving snow. Her blood, dark and sticky on the torn fabric of her sleeve, had stained the white earth beneath her like a desperate plea. Sam's rough hands had moved carefully as he lifted her, sensing the fragility of a life barely clinging to warmth. Inside, the cabin bore the weight of old grief, yet now it held a new presence, uncertain but alive. He wrapped her in the only blanket untouched by memory, feeling the faint pulse of her fragile body beneath the heavy wool. Her dark eyes had met his for a moment, uncertain, wary, yet searching for something beyond words. The wound on her arm was deep but clean, bleeding enough to weaken but not to claim her. Sam had stitched it with quiet precision, hands steady from a past life that seemed distant yet alive in moments like this. She had flinched once, the needle a sharp reminder of pain, but then settled into stillness. Her breathing was shallow but steady as she drifted near sleep by the fire. Sam remained silent, the sound of the crackling flames filling the space between them. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the night, but inside, time seemed to pause. He felt a strange weight shift inside him, something long buried beneath grief and solitude. This girl, injured, silent, and strong in ways he couldn't yet understand, had brought with her a storm that unsettled the stillness he had built around himself. The night was cold, but somehow, the cabin felt less empty. The cabin was heavy with silence, the kind that settles between strangers who share space but not words. Sam moved quietly, each step measured against the creak of floorboards and the soft crackle of the fire. The girl lay wrapped in the blanket near the hearth, her breathing shallow but steady, eyes closed against the weight of exhaustion. He fetched a basin of warm water, steam rising gently as he carried it toward her. His hands, rough and steady, dipped into the water and worked carefully to wash the dried blood from her skin. The wound on her arm, though healing, still needed tending. His touch was gentle but sure, an echo of a past life as a medic, before war and loss had stolen away so much. The girl flinched only once when the needle pierced flesh, her eyes fluttering open briefly, dark and searching. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet acceptance, as if pain was nothing new. Sam said nothing. Words felt unnecessary, fragile between them like the thin walls of the cabin against the biting cold outside. He moved to the window afterward, stepping outside to wash his hands in the snow and breathe in the sharp night air. The wind was a low, mournful song, rattling the cedar branches overhead. It was a night that demanded stillness, but inside him, something had begun to shift. Returning to the fire, he settled into his worn chair, eyes drawn to the girl who now slept with her hands folded lightly on her chest. Her dark hair, braided loosely, caught the firelight in soft waves. The cabin, once a sanctuary of grief and solitude, now held a fragile new presence, one that unsettled the quiet he had built around himself. The night stretched long, but Sam did not try to sleep. Instead, he watched the flames dance and remembered the last time the room had held another breath beside his own. The girl stirred, murmuring something faint and unfamiliar, and he felt the unspoken promise of a story unfolding, one that neither of them yet understood, but both would live. The morning light seeped weakly through the cabin shutters, casting pale shadows on walls lined with memories Sam had long tried to forget. He sat by the fire, the silence thick around him like a heavy cloak. The girl stirred nearby, still fragile but resting easier than the night before. Yet the quiet between them was not peace. It was the weight of unspoken grief pressing down on two lives caught in different storms. Sam's thoughts drifted back to the cottonwood tree by the creek, where his wife lay buried beneath bending branches. He remembered her smile, soft and steady, the way she'd braided wildflowers into her hair each spring. The empty chair with her shawl draped over it, the shelf of herbs untouched since her hands last tended them. These were the ghosts he lived with daily. He had stopped speaking long ago, not because he had no words, but because there was no one left who could hear them. The loss of their child, the daughter who never breathed her first, had sealed the silence even tighter. Each night alone had built walls thicker than the cabin logs, protecting him from pain, but also from connection. Now, the girl's presence unsettled that fragile balance. Her eyes held a shadow of sorrow unfamiliar, but not foreign, a reflection of loss and survival beyond his own. Yet neither spoke of it. Words were fragile things, easily broken, and both carried burdens too raw for sharing. He watched her as she moved quietly around the cabin, folding blankets, sweeping the hearth, her every gesture precise and deliberate. Hunger marked her face with silent lines, but she met his gaze without pleading or demand. There was a fragile truce between them, built from mutual need and wary trust. Outside, the cold prairie held its breath, the snow muffling even the smallest sound. Inside, grief hung like a silent guest, unseen, yet impossible to ignore. And in that stillness, Sam felt the faint stirrings of something long dormant. Hope, perhaps, or the fragile first step toward healing. The days slipped by in quiet routine, each one folding into the next beneath the heavy sky and endless snow. The girl moved through the cabin with a cautious grace, her eyes always alert, scanning shadows as if expecting threats to emerge from the silence. Sam watched her closely, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Trust had not come easily between them. How could it? Both carried scars deeper than wounds, shadows heavier than the cold outside. The girl spoke little, her words measured and sparse, each one weighed carefully before release. Sam, too, kept his voice low, his speech rusty from years of solitude. But in the small moments, the way she folded the blanket he'd left out, the way he left food near the hearth, they built a fragile bridge between fear and hope. One evening, as the wind howled beyond the walls and snow pressed close against the windows, the girl stood by the hearth, wrapping the bandage tighter around her arm. Her fingers worked deftly, hands steady despite the pain beneath the cloth. Sam sat nearby, coffee warming his hands, watching the flickering firelight catch the sharp angles of her face. Their eyes met briefly. No questions, no demands, just a quiet understanding. She did not flee, nor did she plead. Instead, she held her ground, a silent truce formed in the spaces between words. For the first time since she arrived, the weight of fear seemed to loosen its grip. Outside, the prairie lay vast and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, a new kind of warmth had begun to take root. It was not the easy comfort of familiarity, but the tentative spark of trust, fragile, uncertain, yet real. In that stillness, Sam felt something shift within himself, a small thaw beneath years of ice. The girl, too, seemed to breathe easier, no longer merely surviving, but beginning to hope. And though the road ahead remained shrouded in shadow, they faced it together, two wary souls learning to trust in the face of fear. The fire crackled softly in the quiet cabin as shadows stretched long across the rough-hewn walls. Sam sat close to the hearth, the warm glow reflecting off his worn hands and weathered face. The girl sat nearby, her dark eyes watching the flames, distant but attentive. In that flickering light, memories stirred, ghosts of a war long ended but never fully left behind. Sam's mind drifted to fields soaked with red, brothers turned against brothers, and the relentless march of battles that had carved scars deeper than any wound. He had been a medic once, hands steady in the chaos, saving lives even as others were lost. But war was a shadow that clung tightly, refusing to be shaken off. The girl's presence beside him was a reminder that the past was never truly past. Her own story was etched in silence and fear, running from men who took more than they had a right to, leaving wounds invisible but no less raw. Though she spoke little of it, her eyes held the weight of history, of treaties broken, of people displaced, of a world torn apart by violence and loss. They shared no language, yet in the quiet moments, a silent understanding passed between them. The war that had shaped Sam's life and the battles that haunted her people converged here, beneath the same roof, in a fragile space between two weary souls. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grasses like the distant echo of forgotten drums. The snow muffled all but the softest sound, and the night held its breath as if waiting for something unseen. Sam reached out tentatively, placing a rough hand over hers. She did not pull away. In that simple touch was a bridge between worlds, between past and present, pain and healing, fear and hope. The war may have been forgotten by many, but here in this lonely cabin, its whispers remained, a reminder that some battles linger long after the last shot is fired, and that healing begins not with words, but with shared silence. The morning light was pale and cold, casting long shadows across the snow-covered prairie. Sam moved outside to tend the livestock, his breath rising in slow clouds as he checked fences and broke the ice in the water troughs. The air was sharp and still, but something beneath the quiet made his skin prickle, a subtle shift he couldn't ignore. He paused, scanning the horizon where the white expanse met the sky. The usual signs of life were missing. No birds called from the bare branches, no rabbits darted through the brush. Even the wind, usually restless, had stilled as if holding its breath. Near the cabin, the snow bore no fresh tracks, only the faint marks left by his own boots. But farther out, Sam's sharp eyes caught something unsettling. Hoof prints, dozens of them, arranged in a wide circle around the property, like an invisible fence. His heart tightened at the sight. The tracks were fresh, deep impressions pressed firmly into the snow, the work of many horses. They formed a noose, silent and deliberate. Sam's mind flashed to the stories he'd heard, the warnings whispered in the town about those who still rode the land. Warriors painted in red and black, fierce and unyielding. He thought of the soldiers who had driven the Comanche from these plains long ago, and of the girl he'd sheltered, the daughter of a chief, running from more than just soldiers. Inside the cabin, the girl stood near the fire, her eyes wide but calm, scanning the horizon through the frost-coated window. She did not speak, but Sam saw the tension coiled in her posture, the way her fingers tightened around a strip of leather she'd been weaving. He reached for the Winchester above the door but paused, his hand hovering. The rifle might protect against the gunman, but it wouldn't stop what was coming. This was a different kind of danger, older, deeper, tied to ancient laws and unspoken promises. Sam turned slowly from the window and met the girl's steady gaze. Neither needed to say the words. They both knew the warning had come. The circle was closing, and whatever arrived would not ask permission to enter. The wind shifted, carrying a biting cold that seemed to sharpen the edges of the world. Sam stood at the edge of the porch, the worn railing cold beneath his calloused hands. His eyes traced the endless stretch of snow-covered ground, searching for signs, for any clue of what was to come. Then he saw them. Hoofprints pressed deep into the fresh snow. Dozens of them, forming a rough circle that wrapped around the cabin like a silent warning. The tracks were too precise to be chance, too deliberate to be anything but a message. Sam's breath hitched as he followed the line of prints with a slow, steady gaze. They circled wide, enclosing the homestead in a noose of intent. It was a boundary drawn without words, a claim staked in cold earth and frost. He felt the weight of it settle like a stone in his chest. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and the girl stepped out beside him. Her eyes were dark and steady, reflecting the pale light of the morning sky. She moved with a quiet confidence, no longer the fragile figure curled beneath the cedar, but someone shaped by survival and purpose. Her gaze followed his to the tracks, and for a moment they stood side by side, two solitary figures surrounded by the vast silence of the prairie. The snow held its breath around them, muffling even the softest sound. Somewhere distant, a lone crow called, breaking the stillness. Sam's hand instinctively went to the rifle resting against the porch post, but he did not take it up. He knew this was not a fight to be won with bullets. The warning was clear. The circle was closing, and the days ahead would be shaped by forces older than the land itself. Sam met the girl's eyes and saw in them a reflection of his own resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The prairie stretched vast and unyielding, but within that frozen ring of tracks, a quiet strength was born, rooted in trust, sharpened by history, and ready for the storm. The horizon darkened as shapes emerged from the pale morning light. Dozens of riders moving with purpose across the snow-dusted plains. Sam stood at the cabin's edge, eyes narrowed against the cold, watching as the figures crested the low ridge. Their horses' hooves stirred the frozen earth in steady rhythm, a quiet thunder that echoed through the still air. They rode without haste, but with an undeniable command, a wave of earth and bone in motion that felt as ancient as the land itself. Painted faces gleamed in the soft light, streaks of red and black that marked warriors bound by tradition and unyielding loyalty. Each rider sat tall, cloaked in furs and leather, the weight of their presence pressing against the quiet prairie. At their head was a man whose cloak of black wolf fur seemed to drink in the light, his horse adorned with feathers braided through its mane and tail. His face was marked with streaks of red like war tears, expression carved from stone and shadow. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the cabin before resting briefly on Sam. The riders formed a wide ring around the homestead, silent sentinels with weapons unraised but intentions clear. The snow beneath their horses' feet was churned into a rough circle, a living boundary that held both warning and protection. Inside the cabin, the girl stood near the door, shoulders squared, eyes steady. She did not cower or plead, but stepped forward as if claiming her place. Her voice was calm, low, enough to carry beyond the door without raising alarm. "Father," she said. The leader on the wolf-furred horse said nothing at first. His gaze passed over her, then settled back on Sam. The two men regarded each other in a silence heavy with unspoken history, wounds too old for words. The wind stirred, carrying the weight of the moment. Neither side moved, the stillness stretched taut as a bowstring. Then the leader dismounted, boots crunching softly in the snow, stepping forward with a calm authority that demanded respect. The circle remained unbroken, the silent assembly watching, waiting for what would come next. The chief moved forward with deliberate calm, his black wolf fur cloak dragging softly through the snow like a shadow born of the earth itself. Every step he took was measured, each motion carrying the weight of unspoken laws and ancient honor. His painted face, streaked with red that ran like war tears, held an expression carved from old stone, a face shaped by years of leadership, loss, and unyielding resolve. His horse stood silent behind him, feathers braided into its mane and tail, each one stained with ochre and ash. The solemnity of the scene seemed to pull the very air taut, the wind holding its breath as if to witness this sacred moment. Sam remained still, arms loose at his sides, feet planted firmly in the snow. The lines of sleepless nights and unspoken grief were etched deep into his face, matching the gravity in the chief's eyes. Neither man spoke. Words felt inadequate to the weight they carried. The girl stepped forward between them, a quiet shield and bridge, her presence a steady flame in the cold. Her voice came low, certain, without hesitation. "Father," she said again, a simple word loaded with history and expectation. The chief's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Sam, searching for understanding in a language neither had spoken in years. In that gaze was an ancient measure, not of anger, but of judgment. He saw the broken-spirited white man with a cabin full of ghosts, standing beside the only daughter he had left. The surrounding warriors stood silent, forming a living wall of quiet strength and watchful eyes. Spears tipped with sunlight glinted faintly, weapons lowered but ready. No threat had been raised, yet the promise lingered in the stillness. This was a meeting charged with the power of kinship, duty, and unspoken demands. The chief's hand rose slowly, fingers brushing the air, a gesture heavy with meaning. Time stretched thin as the two men faced the invisible line between worlds, waiting to see if it would hold or break beneath the weight of history and choice. The cold settled deep between them as Sam and the chief faced one another beneath the pale sky. Two worlds met in that silent space, one carved from settlers' grief and stubborn survival, the other forged in the fierce traditions of a people bound to the land for generations. Their eyes locked, each searching for something unspoken, a bridge across years of distrust and loss. Sam's hands hung loose, but his body bore the weight of countless battles, those fought on distant fields and those waged inside his own heart. The chief's gaze was steady, filled with a calm authority that commanded respect without a word. Around them, the warriors remained still, their painted faces and poised spears a living testament to heritage and vigilance. Between the two men stood the girl, neither fully one world nor the other, but a living connection woven from both. Her eyes held a strength tempered by hardship, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet certainty of someone who had walked through fire and emerged unbroken. "I chose not to return," she said softly, her words slicing through the cold air. "I ran for those who took more than they had a right to." The chief's jaw tightened, a shadow passing across his face. He turned his gaze to Sam, measuring the man beside the woman he had raised. In silence, Sam met the challenge, unflinching despite the weight of history pressing upon him. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. Who has the right to claim her? What bonds still hold? What choices remain when blood and honor collide? Finally, the chief spoke, his voice low and solemn. "You sheltered her. That is not a question." Sam nodded slowly, the simple act heavy with meaning. It was not ownership, but a recognition of a bond forged in the harshest of storms. The girl stepped forward, her posture steady. I did not run from you. I ran for freedom. In that fragile meeting, the two worlds found a tense understanding. Not complete, but enough to hold for now. The snow fell lightly around them, settling softly on the ground as if the earth itself breathed in quiet hope. The air hung heavy with tension as the chief stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Sam's with a steady intensity. The space between them felt charged, filled with words left unspoken and histories too vast for easy explanation. Each man carried burdens, one shaped by loss and solitude, the other by duty and ancient bonds. You sheltered her, the chief said again, his voice low but unwavering. That is not a question. Sam's jaw tightened, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. He nodded slowly, the gesture carrying a quiet acceptance. It was not a claim of ownership, but acknowledgement of a responsibility neither could deny. The girl stood between them, a living testament to the fractured past and fragile present. Her eyes met her father's, steady and unyielding. I did not run from you, she said clearly. I ran for freedom. The chief's gaze flickered, the hard lines of his face softening just enough to reveal the pain beneath. He took a breath heavy with history. You are not a child, he said, voice carrying the weight of a man who has seen too much loss. Yet I hope to decide for you. She did not flinch, her posture unwavering. I choose my own path, she replied, the firmness in her tone leaving no room for doubt. Sam watched the exchange, feeling the old wounds laid bare between father and daughter, wounds stitched with sorrow, pride, and the fierce grip of tradition. He knew this was more than a meeting of men. It was the collision of worlds where blood and history fought against choice and change. The chief's eyes shifted toward the open prairie beyond the cabin, as if seeking answers in the vast silence. Then, turning back, he spoke again, voice firm but resigned. You have 3 days. After that, I come not as a father, but as a chief. Sam's breath caught at the final words. The circle of warriors remained still, their presence a silent reminder that the past was never far behind. In the cold quiet, the fragile truce held, for now. The moment stretched between them, a fragile thread woven from silence and shared understanding. Neither Sam nor the chief spoke again, but in the quiet between words, a bond was forged, one stronger than any declaration, unbreakable despite the weight of history pressing down around them. The girl stood quietly, her gaze steady and unwavering, no longer a passive presence but a force anchored in her own truth. She had crossed the invisible line that separated daughter from woman, captive from choice, tradition from freedom. Her strength was neither shouted nor demanded. It was simply there, a quiet defiance carried in the set of her shoulders and the calm in her eyes. Sam felt the gravity of that presence settle in his chest, a weight unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He was a man shaped by loss and solitude, but now tethered to something new, something real and alive. The chief's gaze lingered on them both, a silent acknowledgement passing between men who understood the cost of such moments. The circle of warriors shifted subtly, the sound of shifting snow beneath their feet breaking the stillness. Spears remained lowered, eyes watchful but no longer threatening. The tension that had gripped the air loosened, replaced by a cautious respect. As the chief mounted his horse, his eyes met Sam's once more, a look filled with both warning and reluctant acceptance. The past was a heavy burden, but here, beneath the endless sky, a new understanding had taken root. The riders slowly turned, their horses' movements like the ebb and flow of tides, receding but never gone. The vast prairie reclaimed its quiet, the only sound a soft whisper of wind across the snow. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, a warm glow against the chill outside. The girl sat near the hearth, weaving a strip of leather with steady hands, each loop and not a silent promise. Sam settled into his chair, the weight of the day lifting slightly. In the space between loss and hope, An unbreakable bond had been forged, not in words, but in the steadfastness of presence and the courage to choose. The day after the warriors had ridden away, the silence around the cabin felt heavier, charged with an unspoken urgency. Sam moved through his morning tasks with careful precision, feeding the horses, checking fences, and breaking the ice in the water troughs. Every motion was deliberate, his mind caught in the narrow window of time that stretched before him, the 3 days granted by the chief. Inside, the girl moved quietly as well, her hands folding blankets, sweeping the hearth, and tending small chores with a steady rhythm. Though her face remained unreadable, Sam noticed the tension in her movements, the way her fingers tightened around the leather strips she wove, as if anchoring herself to something solid amidst uncertainty. Words between them remained few and measured, a fragile truce built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The air in the cabin was thick with waiting, a slow ticking clock marking the passing hours. Each day closer to the deadline was a step deeper into unknown territory, where history and choice collided. Sam's thoughts often drifted to the circle of hoofprints that still marred the snow outside, a reminder that the past was never far behind, and that the chief's warning was not empty. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders, not just for himself, but for the girl who had chosen to stay. As the sun dipped low behind the ridges, casting long shadows across the prairie, Sam found himself standing at the edge of the porch once more. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying with it the quiet urgency of what was to come. The horizon seemed both endless and confining, a vast expanse that offered freedom yet held the promise of reckoning. The girl joined him silently, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Neither spoke, but in their shared gaze was the acknowledgement that the countdown had begun. The days ahead would test them, push them to face fears long buried and decisions that could not be undone. Together, they stood on the threshold of change, caught between the weight of history and the fragile hope of what lay beyond. The wind pressed cold against the cabin walls as the girl stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the dimming light. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, the tracks of horses fading slowly into the distance. Sam watched her from across the room, the quiet between them heavy with unspoken questions. She turned, eyes steady but shadowed with uncertainty. "You think they will take me back?" she said softly, voice barely above the wind. "That I belong to them." Sam nodded slowly, the truth heavy in the silence. "They will want you to return, not just because you are their daughter, but because you left without permission." Her gaze held his, fierce and unyielding. "But I do not belong to anyone," she replied. "I left to be free." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sam took a step forward, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down like the cold outside. "You could leave now. Ride with me past the ridge. They would chase harder, but at least you would be safe for a time." She shook her head, resolve hardening her features. "If I run, they will believe it was about conquest, about taking what was not given. They will not listen to reason, not at first." Her words cut through the stillness, clear and certain. "I'm not a prize to be claimed," she said. "I am a woman who chooses." Sam searched her eyes, seeing the storm beneath the calm, the fears, the hope, the fierce desire for self-determination. He knew the choice she faced was not easy, a path fraught with danger and sacrifice. "I want you to do what you choose," he said finally, voice low but steady. She met his gaze then, a spark of something tender and strong passing between them. "Then I choose to stay." For a moment, the world outside seemed to pause, the snowflakes drifting silently, the fading light softening the edges of the day. In that quiet space, the girl had made her choice, and with it, a new chapter began, not of escape, but of standing firm in the face of what was to come. The sky was heavy with clouds, low and swollen with the promise of a storm as Sam moved about the cabin, preparing for what lay ahead. His hands worked with quiet purpose, checking the rifle, stacking firewood, and gathering supplies. Each task was deliberate, a steady rhythm against the mounting tension that filled the air. The girl joined him outside, her steps sure despite the biting wind. She carried a bundle of leather strips and tied them carefully, weaving knots with practiced fingers. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon as if reading secrets in the shifting clouds. Sam handed her a length of rope and watched as she fashioned it into reins. Their movements were synchronized, a silent partnership forged in necessity and trust. Though words were few, the unspoken understanding between them grew stronger, a bond readying itself for the trials to come. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. The hearth glowed softly, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. The girl moved with a new confidence, folding blankets and organizing supplies as if claiming the space as her own. Sam took a moment to check the ammunition, the cool metal reassuring in his palm. He felt the weight of the rifle, a tool not just for protection, but a symbol of the precarious line they walked. The wind outside began to rise, tugging at coats and whipping loose strands of hair. The storm was coming, not just in the sky, but in the gathering footsteps beyond the ridge. They stood side by side on the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon where the first distant shadows of riders appeared. Neither flinched. The world around them might be poised on the edge of conflict, but within the cabin, a quiet resolve had taken root. The preparation was more than physical. It was a readiness of spirit, a steadying of heart. Whatever the days ahead held, they would face it together, anchored by the choice to stand firm rather than flee. The morning air was crisp, the sky a pale canvas streaked with the first light of dawn. Sam rode alongside the chief, their horses moving steadily through the sagebrush and low hills. The tension between them was quiet but unmistakable, a test laid not in words, but in the silent code of honor that governed their worlds. Ahead, a lone buck stood alert in a small clearing, ears twitching and eyes wide. The chief slowed his horse and nodded toward the animal, a simple gesture that carried the weight of an unspoken challenge. Sam's fingers tightened around the bough he had been handed days before, the wood smooth and familiar despite the unfamiliarity of this trial. He moved with care, each step measured as he approached the spot the chief had indicated. His breath was steady, the cold air sharp in his lungs. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the target ahead, and the unyielding weight of expectation pressing down. When a moment came, Sam loosed the arrow with calm precision. It flew true, striking just behind the buck's shoulder, a clean shot that echoed respect for the animal and the land. The chief watched without expression, eyes sharp but unreadable. As the buck fell, Sam felt a quiet shift, a subtle acknowledgement passing between men bound by code and history. They rode back toward the cabin, the steady rhythm of hooves marking a new chapter in their uneasy alliance. The chief spoke finally, his voice low and solemn. "You do not speak our words, but your actions say what your mouth does not." Sam met his gaze without hesitation, understanding that this was more than acceptance. It was a recognition of resolve, of honor tested and proven. The path ahead remained uncertain, shadowed by history and threat, but in that moment, the bridge between worlds had been crossed. The test was not just of skill, but of heart, and Sam had passed. The rain began softly, a gentle tapping on the leaves that soon grew into a steady drizzle, washing the earth with its quiet persistence. Sam and the chief rode side by side through the dampened hills, their horses moving carefully over the slick ground. The tension between them had eased, replaced by a shared purpose forged in the silence of the hunt. Ahead, the buck lay still beneath a canopy of dripping branches, its eyes closed in peaceful surrender. The moment carried a weight beyond the kill, a solemn ceremony that bound two men from different worlds in an ancient pact. Sam dismounted slowly, feeling the cool rain seep through his worn coat. He approached the deer with reverence, hands steady as he prepared to honor the animal's life. The chief watched silently, his gaze steady and approving. The hunt was more than a test of skill. It was a ritual of respect, of trust, and of understanding. In that moment, Sam felt the barrier between them dissolve, replaced by a fragile kinship rooted in shared values and mutual respect. As they made their way back to the cabin, the rain softened to a mist, the landscape shimmering with new life. The warriors waited in quiet formation, their faces unreadable, but their presence a steady reminder of the stakes still to come. The chief dismounted and stood before Sam once more, his voice low but clear. "You do not speak like us," he said, "but your actions say what your mouth cannot." He turned then to the girl, his expression shifting from stern to something gentler. "You are no longer of my fire," he declared, "but you are not gone from my heart." The words settled in the cold air, a bittersweet acknowledgment of change and enduring bonds. The warriors mounted again, their horses stirring the damp earth as they prepared to depart. No battle had been fought, no blood spilled, only the quiet sealing of a fate neither could fully command. As the rain eased and the sky cleared, Sam and the girl stood together by the cabin, the promise of what lay ahead etched deep in their hearts. Dark clouds gathered low over the prairie, swelling like a silent threat against the fading light. The wind picked up, whipping dust and dry leaves against the cabin walls as if nature itself braced for the coming reckoning. Sam stood near the porch, shoulders squared against the rising storm, his eyes fixed on the horizon where shadows lengthened and whispers of judgment stirred. Inside, the girl moved with a restless energy, her hands busy with small tasks, yet her gaze distant, caught between fear and fierce determination. The weight of what was to come pressed heavily upon them both, the unyielding scrutiny of a world bound by ancient laws and unspoken expectations. The townsfolk's whispers had already begun, carried on the wind like wildfire. Stories told in hushed tones about the man who sheltered a Comanche girl, about loyalty and defiance, about lines crossed and debts owed. Judgment came not just from distant warriors, but from a society quick to condemn what it did not understand. Sam felt the weight of their eyes, the invisible chains of history tightening around him. Yet beneath the storm of judgment, a stubborn flame burned, a quiet resolve to stand firm, to protect the fragile hope they had carved from the cold earth. The girl met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the firelight and the fierce promise of survival. "They will judge us," she said softly, "but we are more than their words." Together, they faced the coming storm, not just of weather, but of history and consequence. The thunder rolled in the distance, a drumbeat marking the passage of time and the closing of the narrow window they had been given. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Sam and the girl stood side by side, anchored in the truth that judgment could only pierce so deeply. Beyond it lay a bond forged not in approval, but in the courage to choose. The storm raged outside, but within the cabin, a different kind of strength held steady, a promise that whatever came, they would face it together. The days grew longer, and the storm clouds slowly passed, leaving behind a sky washed clear and bright. Inside the cabin, a quiet transformation took root, a rhythm of trust and healing that unfolded in the small, steady moments between them. The sharp edges of fear softened, replaced by the gentle pulse of shared presence. Sam watched as the girl moved through the space with growing confidence, her hands weaving strips of leather into new shapes, her eyes brighter with each passing day. The once heavy silence between them began to lift, replaced by soft words and occasional laughter, a fragile but precious thread weaving two lives together. He found himself speaking more, sharing fragments of his past, the war he had lived through, the losses he bore, and the hope he clung to despite it all. She listened without judgment, offering stories of her own in whispered Comanche words, painting pictures of a life interrupted but not forgotten. Together, they worked the land, repairing fences and tending to the animals, each task a step toward rebuilding not just a homestead, but a life. The cabin, once a place of mourning and solitude, now echoed with the rhythms of renewal. Footsteps crossing floors, fire crackling in the hearth, the soft hum of quiet companionship. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light through the windows, the girl sang, a low, haunting lullaby in her native tongue. The melody carried the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. Sam listened, feeling the music wrap around them like a balm, soothing wounds both old and new. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and unbroken, the grasses whispering in the breeze. Within the cabin's walls, two souls slowly stitched together the fabric of trust and healing, learning that strength often grew not from grand gestures, but from the simple grace of presence. In that shared quiet, they found a new kind of peace, not the absence of pain, but the courage to move forward together. The firelight flickered softly against the cabin walls as Sam and the girl sat close, the space between them filled with a quiet warmth that went beyond the crackling hearth. Time seemed to slow, the world outside fading into a gentle hush where only their steady breaths and the soft glow of the flames remained. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his rough hand, a small gesture laden with meaning. In that touch was a language neither needed to speak aloud, a bond forged not by circumstance but by choice. The walls that had once separated them, of history, culture, and pain, began to dissolve, replaced by something fragile yet unyielding. Sam looked into her eyes and saw reflected there a depth of strength and tenderness that surprised him. She was no longer simply the girl he had found in the snow, but a woman who had claimed her place beside him. Her presence had stirred something long buried beneath grief and solitude, a spark that flickered with hope and possibility. They spoke little, but in the silence between words, love grew, a quiet, steady force that transcended the boundaries set by the world beyond their cabin. It was not a love born of grand declarations or fiery passion, but of shared resilience and the courage to choose each other despite the odds. Outside, the prairie stretched wide under a sky painted with stars, infinite and fierce. The night held its breath, as if honoring the sacred moment unfolding within the humble walls of the cabin. Sam reached for her hand, his fingers curling gently around hers, anchoring them both in the present, a present carved from hardship and hope. They did not speak of forever. Such promises felt too large for the fragile space they occupied. Instead, they let the moment speak for itself, a quiet affirmation of connection and trust. In the stillness, beneath the vast sky, two souls found a love beyond boundaries, a love that would carry them through whatever storms remained to come. The first light of morning spilled softly through the cabin window, casting a warm glow over the worn wood and simple furnishings. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and open, touched by the gentle gold of dawn. Inside, a quiet peace settled over the room, a peace born not from forgetting the past, but from the courage to build anew. Sam moved slowly, his hands steady as he gathered supplies and prepared for the day ahead. The weight that once pressed heavily upon him had softened, replaced by a steady resolve that carried him forward. Beside him, the girl, no longer just a visitor but a partner in life, moved with calm purpose, her presence a steady rhythm that grounded the space between them. They worked together, repairing fences, tending the animals, and tending to the small tasks that made a home. Each act was a stitch in the fabric of their shared life, a weaving of two stories once separate but now intertwined. The cabin, once a tomb of memories and solitude, now echoed with the sounds of renewal. The soft murmur of conversation, the steady beat of footsteps, the crackle of fire. In the quiet moments, they shared glances and touches that spoke of a bond deeper than words. The shawl she wore, once his wife's, had been stitched with new edges and bright threads of blue, a symbol of respect for the past and a claim on the future. The small necklace of carved bone he had given her lay on the table, a quiet promise of seeing and choosing. Outside, the prairie held the memory of snow, but now bloomed with new life. Grass bending gently in the breeze, birds calling softly in the distance. The world had not changed overnight, but within their small corner, a life was being rebuilt, rooted not in conquest or loss, but in consent, recognition, and hope. As the sun climbed higher, Sam and the girl stood together by the cedar tree, their tree, hands clasped, hearts steady. They had endured the long ride, faced the storms, and now, at last, had found a home in each other and the land they both called theirs.